Yeah! 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 Kia! 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 Kia!
Hello, I'm Mike Micah, president of Digital Eclipse, and I'm here to talk about the remastering of Karateka. How do you pronounce the game? That's the fun part of this whole thing. And one of the fun parts for me going into this was listening to how everybody pronounces the game that I work with. I pronounce it, and I've always pronounced it, and you're going to hear me say this all the time, is Karateka. But then I've heard people say Karateka, Karateka, and Karateka in other ways. But Karateka is the way I've said it. And I think I've run into more people who say it like I do than any other way. But honestly, ultimately, it's up to Jordan, and Jordan pronounces it. And I might get this wrong, but he pronounces it Karateka.
Kia!
Karateka is one of my favorite games of all time. I've even tried to port the game probably 33 years ago now, I think, when I was still in high school, to the Commodore Amiga. So for me, it was a lot of unfinished business. I wanted to get back to porting Karateka. And approaching this project, one of the things that kind of excited me and interested me most was why, outside of the holy trinity of versions of Karateka, did all the other ports just suck? And I think that a lot of that has to do with the fact that people didn't really understand it, or didn't have the source code, or they were just in a completely different frame of mind for this sort of game. Without specifically calling out certain platforms and certain games, what really kind of stood out to me is that people who tried to port Karateka previously approached it in a way that was very common back in the day. Very simple gameplay, very state-driven, the antithesis of cinematic, which is kind of the purpose of Karateka. It's meant to be a movie you play. And their approach was to take a game and make it feel more arcadey and feel very immediate. And as a result, it was just very unnatural and very, very hard to play.
Kia!
Karateka is one of my favorite games of all. The The gate was just a large graphic on the Apple II, and it was just impossible to move it around. You couldn't really scroll it very quickly. But it was also a really iconic moment in the game because when you arrive at the castle, you meet the guard and there's the gate, and that's just like every screenshot of the old Karateka game is pretty much that. And because Jordan wanted to make it parallax, there's some interesting challenges here because I wanted to draw the gate like he would draw it on the Apple II. So I actually do line draws like you would on an Apple II. So that gate is not a 3D object. It's actually using the same kind of routines that Jordan used, but to draw it in that parallaxing way. So I wanted to approach it the same way that Choplifter and Jordan intended to draw that gate being parallax in 3D. So it's not a 3D object, but the other thing that came out of it was the gate served as a sort of break in the gameplay of the original game so it could show a cutscene. He mainly did that because he needed to load data into the game, and so it was a clever way to get data to load back and forth and use that break to take advantage of that. Since we didn't have that anymore, it seemed really odd to be going through this 3D gate and then have it stop and go to a cutscene. It just didn't fit anymore. So going back over the game and reading through the journals again, there was some more stuff he wanted to do cinematically with the game. Particularly, I believe, whether in conversation or in his book, he talked about having the guard start running toward Akuma to go tell him, and you see that. So this is an opportunity to have that happen. So when you get past the gate and you encounter the next player or the next enemy, when you take down that enemy, that's when the cutscene triggers, and you see the other one guard going the opposite direction to go run up to tell Akuma that somebody's arrived. And so I was able to capture that moment too. The gate was just a large graphic.
Yeah.
If I approach this as it being just a modern PC remaster, that's already been done. There was already another Karateka that was kind of a modern take on Karateka. My fascination sat with the idea that I wanted to figure out what the obstacles were to people who were porting the game and try to understand why that was so challenging. Because I think when you first look at Karateka, on its surface, you're like, all right, one-on-one combat, very simple mechanics, that should be easy to do. But it really isn't. And when you start digging into Jordan's code, you start to realize he had created basically the perfect clockwork version of a fighting game that was very cinematic, but on top of that, he had spent a couple years really optimizing everything to just work perfectly. If you just move one byte this way or one byte that way, the game breaks. And it was like the ultimate optimization. For me to approach this then and try to port it, it's easy to do a port to a modern system because you can do anything you want. It's like it's beyond the scope or the realm of anything else that you would need to worry about. There's no limitations, so you don't have to optimize. So in my mind, I wanted to go back and kind of approach it in the way that the team that ported Prince of Persia, Jordan's other game, did to the PC, the VGA PC. That was a version. If you look at the Apple II version, you look at the PC version, they're very different, and they play great. But the PC version is like this. It's a system that had so much more power, yet showed restraint and kind of worked within the limitations of what the original platform was, so that it retained the feel and look of that original game. So for me, I created basically a fantasy platform. I created was essentially like a VGA PC or an Amiga, very similar to the machine I originally tried to port this game to many years ago. I approached it like that. So I created my own system with its own limitations so that I had a target platform that I could take the original game and try to make it work on. And from that, I was hoping I would find all these obstacles that everybody else ran into. The approach to the animation in the newer version of Karateka had to be very delicately handled because we did not want to remove or change any of the keyframes of the original game. By doing that, it suddenly wasn't Karateka anymore. It really had to be his father, and everything else that he rotoscoped had to stay retained in there. So what we had to do then was to make sure that those were retained, but everything in between had to be an interpolation. And we could have just used AI, we could have used any other ways to generate that animation, but it just didn't look natural. So the best approach was literally going in by hand and figuring out the weight and the distance and the travel of every bit of motion and look at those frames back and forth until you could figure out a trajectory for the in-between frames and just by hand draw those frames in. And thankfully, the game doesn't have a lot of color. Even the new version doesn't have a lot of color. So that reduced the amount of work. You can hide a lot of detail in the white of his gi, and the other costumes in the game have a lot of solid color space. So you can hide a lot of movement there and insinuate movement without doing much. So it really just kind of worked out.
Yeah.
There were a lot of things in the original Karateka that worked so wonderfully around the limitations of the Apple II. Like Jordan would draw very large objects. And when those objects were being drawn, he wouldn't move the screen because he knew that to redraw those objects across the screen would bring the frame rate down to an extreme crawl. So he worked really well around those limitations. And I wanted to do the same thing. I wanted to have a limit of how many things I could draw, which would force me not to go overboard on everything. It doesn't mean that I didn't add flourishes or anything like that in there. There were a lot of things in his notes that he wanted to do on the original Apple version that were left on the cutting room floor because of these reasons. Like one of those things was the main gate. So I want to make sure that this platform I was creating from scratch could at least accomplish things like that. It was more or less a platform that was going to cover just enough and improve the limitations just enough so that some of those things that Jordan wanted to put in the game originally could be done, but not more than that. I kind of want it to be kind of like perfectly in that sweet spot.
Yeah.
One of the other options we added to the game was scan lines because we created this fictional platform that's kind of like a PC VGA quality platform, and there's this raw pixel mode. But I also wanted it to feel like you're playing a vintage style platform from maybe like the 80s into the 90s. That this like extra version of Karateka is being ported to the system, and to do that, I want to make sure it felt like it was on a display. So we've added a scanline mode as well here, like we do in the other versions of the game, just to make it feel more connected to those older versions, but also in era, which I think is it's the way I prefer to play it because it feels like I'm playing on something more tangible, more like a real system. Even though a modern system's real, I want something that feels like real from like the 80s. One of the other options we added to the game was one of the things we also noticed is in the various versions of Karateka, and in particular, one of the versions of the Commodore 64 that Veda was working on, at some point there was this alternate soundtrack. There's kind of like a rhythmic musical thing that goes on during gameplay. That was kind of interesting because most of the game is quiet. A lot of the reason for that is because the Apple II had a single speaker and you had one byte that you can change and it would tell the speaker to like move in or out. And you had to like generate tones by literally making the speaker move. And that's why the sound takes over the gameplay. So there's no movement when sound's playing and all these sorts of things. And so sound was always kind of, while the music is amazing and it's just brilliantly composed, the ability to play that music has been very challenged in all these versions of Karateka, and it just squeaked by with enough of it. But most of the game is very quiet. And so when there's a lot of action, it feels weird now in the modern sense to watch a lot of action on screen but have it be silent, or have like little hits and pops. And so part of the remaster was to go in there and also add music for combat sequences to help heighten the anxiety of the player to make it feel a little bit more important. But we didn't want to do it in such a way that was going to be competitive to or try to live up to what Francis Mechner had created for Karateka. So we're going with something, again, inspired by the Commodore 64 iterative version of the game that's a little more percussive and ways to try and kind of like not clash with the music that was composed for the game, or to not give us an opportunity to recompose stuff because we shouldn't. So that's just used to help heighten the anxiety during fights and to add to the feel of the game, so it doesn't feel so quiet in certain parts. And then ultimately, too, the music that we have in the remaster comes from all versions of Karateka because each version had something different, and there was all the music was composed by Francis. So I want to make sure that we had a complete soundscape that came from his compositions.
Yeah.
One of the things we've said for years internally here at Digital Eclipse was that when we approached doing remasters, we really wanted to make the game you remember, not necessarily the game that it actually is. Because a lot of older games, when you play them today, they're not. You almost spoil the memory you have of that game because it was a different time and there weren't advances in controllers and all these other things that you got really good. Again, you got really good at a certain kind of interface, and those games were a lot easier to play back then. But now, this approach really, like with the Karateka remaster in particular, the idea was to make that game you remembered in your head, not necessarily the game it was, because there were frame rate slowdown and all this other kind of stuff the issues that were kind of going on in that original game. This was going to run at a consistent frame rate, and it was going to have the ability for you to react in certain ways. And because the game is faster, it actually makes it more difficult. So I had to extend the windows of anticipation and all these things, and the AI had to kind of tune down the AI a little bit because the game, when it's running at a faster clip, the AI is making decisions faster than you are. And initially, when I kind of ported everything over, the AI would just crush you instantly. They just kind of come up and just take you down all the time. So I had to really expand on the speed and the AI decision making windows to make it a little bit easier for the player. So from day one, the idea was to make it a little bit more accessible, to feel a little more natural, to feel a little bit more modern, and hopefully that would make it a lot easier for people.
Yeah.
One thing about what Jordan had done with the game in that cinematic approach is that he applied cinematic techniques, like with very cinematic wipes and other ways to present scenes. And in his journals, he talked about his love of cinema and all the things that come with that and the approach to movie making. It mimicked a lot of what I had gone through in film school for myself. And one of the things that kind of stood out to me was the idea that you have this emotion as the story transpires, and you kind of put color to that. So you have like a color palette, and a lot of movies, like blues represent calm and reds represent conflict and everything else. So I wanted to approach this the same way because I wanted to extend what Jordan was doing cinematically. So why don't we apply some of these cinematic approaches? So the game starts off with a very bright palette, and it has cherry blossoms blowing in the wind and everything, and it just seems kind of like a nice setting. But the further you go through the first level, the sky starts to darken, things start to get more foreboding, and it's just this old cinematic trick being applied to Karateka. One thing about what Jordan had done with the game
Yeah. Yeah.
One thing about what Jordan had done with the game one like with very cinematic in many ways, Jordan at an early age was obviously a genius because his approach to the AI in Karateka is super simple and elegant, but it came from something much more complicated. What he wanted it to do, he achieved, and he did it really well. But it was the reduction of that logic is where the genius was. He reduced that logic to very simple states that were complex systems that play out, but it doesn't feel, when you're playing the game, it doesn't feel like you're just playing against a very rote state-based system. It feels very natural. And when you look at that and you say, okay, let's go ahead and transcribe that. Let's refactor that AI into something that's running at a higher frame rate. And all it should be is let's take that, transcribe it, and then run that logic at a slower rate so it can match up with kind of what the original game did, but then feed the new actors in the game the information of what to do. That was the first step, and it failed miserably. It was awful. So then I had to go in and approach it with let's understand what he's doing, and let me try to unwrap and unravel his very tight code to see what it probably looked like beforehand. And getting that to unravel became another challenge because it was really hard to reverse that and go back to an original state that Jordan had when he was first putting the AI together. And even though I thought I was getting it right, it was still not performing the way the original game performed. So then I just basically took the logic that was in the original game and took it at the high level of what every player could do, looked at what the code, the disassembly we had made, looked at what that code did, and I tried to just create another state machine that wanted to do the same things at the same time for the same reasons, and then do a more modern approach to AI playing it out. And that was the best approach, and that's the approach that's in the game today, but it still didn't get as tight and as good as what Jordan had done in the original Karateka. So in many areas where we've kind of improved things or just made things feel a bit more modern, I still feel even now the AI in the attempt to port this game is probably the weakest part of the game. And that really has to do with how good the original game was and how much Jordan had put into the thought process for how the AI would play out. And just trying to recreate that and refactor that in a modern sense just proved like basically you couldn't pull it off. I still remember when I first played Karateka, I went to this store called Micro World Computer Center, and they had it for rent, and I didn't know what it was. It was new, so I asked them to bring the box down. I looked at it. I just couldn't believe what I was looking at. It just looked too good to be true, so I rented it, and then I rented it for like the next, I think you had it for a week every time you rented it. I rented it for like the next 6 weeks, and so much so that when I finally brought it back the next time I said I wanted to rent it again, the guy there was like, hey, guess what? Like, you've rented this so much, you basically bought it. You can have it if you want it. And I'm like, yes! And so I brought this game home, and I had already beaten it so many times. All my friends had beaten it so many times. But what we were doing is we created these goals for ourselves. We're like, okay, let's see if we can get through the game without getting hit once. Can you get through the game and with every character you encounter, can you kick them under the belt? Can you do all these things? Like all these little nuances that we just appreciated about the game became goals to us. And everybody's like striving to be able to do it first. And so in this remaster, I really wanted to capture kind of what people like myself, and I've run into so many other people who did the same thing, and they do this, a lot of people do this with all kinds of games. And at this point I was like, why don't we just recognize this stuff? So I asked a bunch of people who had played Karateka a lot, like what do they mentally keep track of when they were playing the game? If they've already beaten it several times, what was the thing they always like to do? And that became our goal list. So you basically have in the game a list of goals, and when you achieve these goals during gameplay, you'll see a little alert come up and tell you you've done it. And then you can go into this, basically the goal chart or little checklist, and see all the things you've accomplished. It was just an extra layer to the game for when you've beaten the game, it gave you something else extra to do. And for us back then, that was extended the life of the game, and now we're just memorializing it. Well, the bird in Karateka, that's a whole other thing. So the bird breaks up the... Well, the bird in Karateka, that's a whole other thing. So the bird is really important to what the story is. It's really important to the pacing of the game. It breaks up the monotony of the enemies, and it really makes it feel like you're progressing through the game. It was a great add. Whether the bird is an eagle, a vulture, or whatever, I don't think anybody knows. I don't even know if Jordan really knows. I think it just changed along in production, but ultimately, it was one of the more challenging parts of the entire game. But it also played a role in the copy protection of the game as well. So many people who have horrible memories of the bird only have those horrible memories of the bird because the bird became substantially harder if you copied the game. And it was the thing designed to kill you so you couldn't beat the game because it knew that you made a copy of the game. It's ruthless. And I bet probably 80% of the people who have this game right now who are listening to me are like, wait a minute, maybe that's why the bird was so hard. And it probably was because you copied it, you pirate. The bird is another thing that really helps slow down the pace of the game because at some point you start to get really good at the enemies, and the bird suddenly appears. Now it's like chess. It has this compound effect of movement and things you have to kind of deal with. And so you encounter the bird 2 times. You encounter it when you're in level 2, and you hear this jingle, and you know something's coming up. And if you keep running, the bird hits you and you die, which is another part of the Karateka lore, which is just if you run into anything, you're gonna die. Surprised you can't just die by running into a door, but like everything else you can run into, you just die. So like the bird is designed for that. So it kind of tricks you. So that's one of the first tricks Karateka throws at you is like you're running, you think you're gonna encounter this other guy because you got used to in the first act running and encountering a guy and stopping and fighting. So you hear the alert and you're like, okay, here comes this guy, and I'm gonna run up till I see him, and a bird comes out and just kills you instantly. That's what it does. And that's kind of the layers that Karateka has throughout the game. You get challenged like that again and again because Jordan would play with what you think you know and then do the opposite of that.
Yeah.
During the production, I took a break working on the port for a little while because the rest of the product still had to come together, and we still had to put a bunch of stuff in as far as like all the artifacts and everything are in the project. So I was away from the code for a while, and I came back and saw the game with basically fresh eyes, and also other people started to play it again too, and I could hear through my walls the frustration people had with how many times they were dying playing the game. And one of the suggestions that had come from Chris Kohler, the editorial director on the project, was that he wanted to have multiple lives in the game because having one single life is just unbearable these days. While I personally disagree, I valued the feedback and really understood that, like, objectively, yes, we need to do that. So one of the things I did was immediately allow you to increase the number of lives you have during the game. And one of the suggestions that Chris had made was when you die, you should leave the player's body there and then spawn a little further back. And you can just basically pile up your bodies if you want. And I thought that was hilarious. And so I implemented that, and it did change the feel of the game in a way that was much more positive, I think, for modern game players. And gives you a chance to actually beat the game. And it does give you a chance to. I didn't penalize you so harshly like the original game, where if you get to the end and you don't run into Mariko's arms, she'll just kick you, and you die. Now you can die, and then you spawn again and be like, okay, I'm gonna run into her arms this time.
Yeah. Yeah.
When you start getting further into the game, we really explored more of the cinematic lighting and color palette. The goal here was when you go through the second act and you're on the inside of the castle, lighting's coming down. It's at sunset. We have reflections that are literally just sprites inverted and half drawn color, and doing all the same kind of tricks that you would do on an old platform, but just trying to achieve in our minds, if this were Jordan and you had this platform with this much power, how far could you push it visually using the old tricks? And that's what we were trying to do.
Yeah. Yeah.
Karateka is well known for its ending being kind of brutal and that you can just die instantly. But before that, you sort of learn a little bit of Jordan's thinking in this with the gate. The gate in section 2 is one of those things I think also, I don't think there's anybody who didn't die from that first and then understand what you have to do after that. And again, that was one of the hardest parts of the game because you have to time your walk through the gate. And I remember on the Commodore 64 version, having so much trouble lining my character up just enough so I could kick and get the foot under the gate so the gate drops, but you won't die if your foot's under the gate. And then waiting for the gate to be just about at head height and then walk through. Every time I tried to run through, I'd always die because like it took too long for me to stand up and then run and die. So my trick that I always use is to put my leg into the gate so it's partially under the gate, and once once you kick, it triggers the gate and it drops. And then wait for the gate to go up, and just before it gets above your head, walk through the gate. And that should work every time.
Yeah.
One of the more exciting aspects of working on this port of Karateka was the idea that we could go back and finish what the team originally intended to do with the leopard. And the leopard is it's an animation we found on one of the discs that Jordan had. I think it was created by Lauren Elliott, and there was enough animation to get a sense that the leopard could run, jump, and sit, and there's just enough there to kind of derive a little move set. But outside of that, everybody we talked to had a different perception of what the leopard was supposed to do, from Jordan to everybody else. It was, I think everybody back in the day had an idea of what they wanted to do with it. None of them agreed on it, and that's ultimately probably what happened. to the leopard not being in the game outside of time. And I know Veda really wanted to incorporate it. She was really into the idea of putting it into the game. So the best notes we got were the notes we got from Veda and what was in Jordan's journal. And from there, it was more or less, let's try to conceive of what Jordan likely would have wanted to do. And the way to do that was to take his next game, Prince of Persia, and take Karateka. If there was any other mechanics that were going to show up in Karateka, they'd probably be somewhere in between those two games, mechanically speaking. So what we took then from Prince of Persia was the pressure plate concept. We kept the gate that was in the first or the second section of Karateka, and the idea that the gate now could be dropped by the pressure plate and make that sort of a puzzle. And what you're doing is you're trying to work out this puzzle to keep the leopard away from you long enough that it has to go around and come get you. And when that's happening, you need to sneak through the gate as quick as possible. And that was happening. You need to sneak through the gate as quick as possible. And that's the puzzle. And that was as simple as we wanted to be, because if we went any more complicated, we would really be changing the gameplay. And it also fit that checkbox of like whatever new thing you're going to add to Karateka has to just kill you instantly, pretty much. And then you learn from that. And so this was another similar approach to Jordan's theory of game design at this point, and we kind of put it in there. It's really meant to be a curiosity for people who maybe fantasize what it would be like to have that scene back in Karateka. It's more or less for people who were on the team as well as for ourselves, because when you see that sprite artwork, you really want to know what that was going to be like in the game. And while we created and invented what that could be, it still kind of scratches that itch of what could have been.
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
So when Karateka was finally published, I guess I was a senior in college. It was my senior year by the time it was finally published and released. And I remember for the first few months, it was kind of a letdown. It seemed like it was going to be a flop, that it wasn't going to sell well. And that was because, I mean, in retrospect, it's because in those days there was no marketing, there was no advertising for games. Because it shipped in, I think, November or December. It just took a few months before anybody really found out that the game was out there. The word of mouth built very slowly. So I went back to school after the winter holiday, kind of thinking, well, worked for a couple of years on this game and, it's good, I'm proud of it, but it's not really doing anything. It's not, it's not gonna, be a big hit or change my life in, the ways that I was dreaming of. And then slowly it kind of started to build, and I think it was in the spring that we found out that it was #1 on Billboard magazine's chart. And then the first big check arrived, and it was like, it wasn't just more than I had ever earned by my own efforts before. It was like it paid for my tuition for that year. I spent 3 or 4 years making Prince of Persia. That whole time I was living off the Karateka royalties, and Karateka made Prince of Persia possible.
Right.
It's easy to care about story now because everyone has to, right? Story is, in most games, considered like a mandatory aspect. Jordan predates all of that. I think he really was one of the early pioneers of story and video games can go together and they can complement one another, and the game's more interesting because it has a story. I think he was one of the first people to really push that idea.
He was always willing to work with other people and wanted to have creative control, but he saw them more like movies. He saw it being a collection of talents, and that didn't bother him at all. I think it's obvious now that that's where everything was going. If you look at all the huge sellers now, they all have the movie metaphor. And I think Jordan not only saw that, but knew how to do that, or was willing to learn how to do that long before most others did.
Yeah, I think the big thing about Jordan first is he's multidisciplinary. And I think that's one of the things that all the top designers, when you go back and you look at who are the people who've really kind of rerouted the course of video game history, it tends to be people like that who either have come from other fields or have significant training in other fields and are able to do mashups with what video game potential is. Jordan's kind of a quintessential example of that, right? When you look across the kind of the history there, right? And whether you start with Karateka and you go to Prince of Persia and then forward with that franchise and his later involvement, what at each step, what each of those big leaps has done is tend to change or reorient our way of thinking about doing video games. And I think that comes because he isn't just coming at it as, oh, I can make a video game, right? He's coming at it as, I can make a work and I can bring to this work things from other disciplines, other parts of life, other craftsmanship, other skill sets. Just the fact that he documented what he was doing in the way he did is deeply unusual. That isn't the mode that most people work in. He's a super smart guy who brought to bear tools that most game devs just didn't have. And that's what led him to be able to create things that most game devs at the time couldn't make.
I didn't know who he was, I didn't know his age. But I remember the beginning of the game, it was, a game by Jordan Mechner, came up on the screen. And so it's like, I didn't know who Jordan Mechner was, but I wanted to be like Jordan Mechner. It's like, I want to make a game. I have stories to tell, I can make pixels.
Well, what did you think of computer games at this time, 1980, 81, 82?
I saw it as one of the huge applications of computers. Any futurist could look ahead and see that the computer, even though it was a very primitive thing at that time, that it would revolutionize the world. Everybody saw that, but not the degree to which it did.
There was a 5-year period where Karateka was it. It was the model. And I think what's amazing about that is that, the pace at which innovation was happening back then, the pace at which ideas were blooming, You know, 1 year then was like 5 years now, right? So that means it kind of really stuck out as a precursor of everything that games would be.
I kind of expected that computer games would become important, but that wasn't influencing me in how I related to you. Yeah. I wasn't thinking of it as a business thing. I just thought of it as one of your passions that should be developed to the full, you know, pursued to its logical conclusion.
So you were interested in these computer games just because I was interested in them?
Yeah, oh, entirely. I mean, I had no interest in them at that time. I never played a computer game. Didn't expect that I would ever.
100 years from now, people are going to look back at Karateka, and they're going to see the very beginning of what by then will be a vibrant interactive medium that has evolved far beyond film, far beyond what we know today, because it had humanity. It borrowed elements from film that made film relevant to most people, not just geeks, right? About people and stories and about emotion. One reason that video games are so popular is because of the emotions they evoke. And prior to that, prior to Jordan, so much of it was about violence or satisfaction or the tension. And this is the first game I had ever seen where somebody fell in love.
It's not that we didn't have really big swings at storytelling. We did, right? Like some of the stuff that was happening in the Infocom games in plain text was huge, just really big swings. But they weren't graphical, they weren't visual, right? And I think what Karateka really brought to the table was sort of filmic language in a bunch of ways. The shot framing, the crawl, scene setup, cross cuts, seamless integration of action and drama. All of those things are, to my mind, what Karateka really laid the groundwork for.
I think that Karateka will stand the test of time as one of the most elegant, the most cinematic, and most carefully crafted game experiences that's ever been done. It's just a jewel that still holds up to this day as one of the most classic games ever, one of the most powerful storytelling games ever, and one of the games that has a quality bar in every second and every pixel of the game. It's amazing.
Okay, I think they've got enough.
Yeah.